Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Jeremy Stern to talk about applying business strategies to nonprofit fundraising. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's really great to be here.
So for people who are hearing you for the very first time, can you please share your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Yeah, I feel weird saying that it has anything to do with being a superhero, but I was thinking about that, and I have perhaps a different origin story than a lot of other people do, and I recognize that I'm weird in this sense, which is I distinctly remember when I was like 15 years old, sitting with one of my friends, and you could tell that I was not one of the cool kids because we were talking about what we were going to do with our lives, and I said, you know what? I want to be a nonprofit executive director. That's what I want to do when I was 15. And I had the whole course planned out of what I was going to do and, degrees and things like that. And that's what I did. And my problem was that by the time I was 25, I was a nonprofit executive director. Now, that might sound kind of like wow, at 25, it was me and an intern. This was a very small grassroots nonprofit organization. And I did that for 9 years. And then it was like, well, now what, right? Like I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish in life. I became a nonprofit executive director. So that's where things really started for me. And we can talk more about the rest, but that was my origin.
First of all, it's not the cool kids, it's all the geeks and the nerds that rule the world. So don't worry about being a geek or a nerd when you're younger.
Well, thank you. You make me feel better.
Was there a particular, do you know the thinking behind that? Why were you so focused from such an early age to say, this is the path for me? Was there an influence that you had or a mentor or a hero that you looked up to that said, wow, I would love to be like this person. That's why I want to be a executive director?
Wow, that's a great question. You know what? One of my best friends, his father was a professional fundraiser. He was an ED of an organization, and he actually worked at a few different organizations over the years. And I was just always impressed by him, and I love spending time with his family. I love my family as well, but always enjoyed spending time with his family and just seeing the sense of mission in the work that he did. And I think now, I haven't thought much about this, so I really appreciate the question, but I think that probably had a lot to do with it.
Awesome. Yep. I find in general, I've noticed at least, and maybe I'm just a bit biased, but at a certain point, a lot of people get to a stage in their life where they say that, I've received quite a bit. I've been very fortunate with my career and my personal life, and the need to give back to the community in some way comes up. And to share a similar story, it was my father that was volunteering once he retired. That also inspired me to move more into the nonprofit direction. So, kindred spirits.
Awesome.
Okay, so the topic today is obviously there's the category of organizations that are the for-profit ones. There are the category of organizations that are nonprofit. For the most part, and we've kind of discussed this before on the show, that nonprofit is really just a tax status, and that really should be it. I mean, there isn't how you structure the organization, how certain outcomes are determined, are mostly aligned. I wanted to know your perspective on that topic because I haven't yet seen someone who has a counterpoint, and it's okay if you share the same opinion, but I want to know your perspective on how should a nonprofit perceive themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've been listening for the past several weeks to many of your guests, and I know that this question has come up. And maybe I'll try to give a little bit of a counterpoint, which is that perhaps from one perspective, nonprofit should just be a tax status, but practically it's not, and it's not in many ways. And we can talk about this, and it really has a lot to do with the business mindset, which nonprofits so often don't have. And utilizing best practices from the for-profit world in nonprofits in terms of administration and management and organizational skills and fundraising especially. But I actually think nonprofits can be more than that, in the sense that because nonprofits are mission driven, the sense of meaning and purpose that they provide enables them to expand so much beyond and give so much more than what for-profits can do. So again, from one perspective, in the way that they operate, they perhaps it should just be a tax status, but in terms of thinking bigger and more broadly speaking, they can be so much more than that.
The whole concept of focusing on a mission is what, for me, I've always found fascinating, in the sense that it's not about trying to make as much money as we can for the shareholders, right? Profit is not the primary goal. And luckily, there are more and more organizations, for-profit organizations, that are trying to create better and good for the world, but it's not happening as often as it should. So it's up to the nonprofit organizations to take that mantle and focus on that. And obviously, money has to come into play here to be able to do that mission. But the fact that the focus is the mission, the supporting the community, the helping the fellow person next to you, really attracts different kinds of people to the cause. People who are passionate, who are usually more generous. I wanted to know if that was, you found the same thing from your experience. What other, let's say, benefits can nonprofits have or leverage that are not available or not easily available for-profit companies?
It's a great question. I think what you're talking about in terms of the meaning and sense of mission and the people who are working there, who often could be working in the for-profit world, but want to be giving back and want to be engaged in making the world a better place, right? Just to say it very simply, but addressing needs within our society and having that sense of, I'm going to work and doing something meaningful with my time and with a sacrifice, because typically that comes at a financial sacrifice where you could be making more in the for-profit world, but there is this exchange of profit for certainly for the individual, the employee, and instead gaining meaning, purpose, value on a deeper level. And you so often see people go so far above and beyond in their work, not because they're getting paid any more for it, but because it's so meaningful to them and they want to give back in that way.
Yeah, when the motivating factors are internal, that you feel good when you do some work, it's much more powerful than if it's external incentives like money and finances.
100%.
Let's then take a step back. There are definitely some elements of for-profit companies. You mentioned a couple earlier, some best practices that nonprofits can leverage from for-profit companies. You mentioned admin, management, organization skills, fundraising, and we have a couple others on my list here that I thought of as well. Do you want to maybe go through each one of them, or do you want to tackle them all as a whole to figure out just, what are these practices? And for each one, more or less, even if it's just a sentence, what are some advantages or ways that nonprofits can use these to their advantage that they can borrow from the for-profit world, I should say?
Yeah, well, maybe we'll just to kind of an intro to this issue, which is my background is for 15 years I worked in nonprofit organizations. So I mentioned I worked at a grassroots nonprofit. I was there for 11 years. I was the ED for 9 years, and it was a small shop, right? A small organization where when I started off as the ED, it was me and an intern. By the time I left, 8.5, 9 years later, we had 8 full-time employees. So I grew the organization year after year. But as the ED of a small shop, I wore all the hats, right? As is so often the case in small organizations. But one of those hats, and a primary hat, was fundraising. So I was responsible for fundraising for that organization. And then for about 3 years after that, I worked in 2 mid-sized organizations, each for about 1.5 years, also focus on fundraising. So altogether, and some other work that I did, it was about 15 years working in nonprofit organizations. And for the past 3 years, I've been working with nonprofit organizations at CauseMatch. CauseMatch is a digital fundraising platform, but we are a social enterprise. We are a for-profit company working with nonprofits in their digital fundraising, enabling organizations to scale up their fundraising. And it's been eye-opening for me, just fascinating to see the difference between working in nonprofits. And I mentioned I worked at a small shop, but after that, I worked for two mid-sized organizations. Each were raising, I was part of a team raising millions of dollars a year. So they were pretty significant organizations, not small shops by any means. And now moving 3 years ago, moving over to the for-profit world and seeing how a for-profit company operates, one that is really has a growth mindset, mission-driven, but really utilizing best practices from the business world to grow the company. And it's night and day. It's really night and day. The focus on metrics, on leading and lagging indicators, on tracking progress and success, goal setting. When I worked in nonprofit fundraising, so often the goal was, okay, this is how much you need to raise over the course of the year. Good luck. We'll see you in 12 months, right? And so now working in a for-profit company, which is growing and operates in a very strategic fashion, and every day, every week, every month is tracked, and we have metrics, we have goals that we're setting to see exactly where we are in terms of our growth and what we're supposed to be doing. So that's in terms of the approach that's taken, and then in terms of technology and the tools that are utilized. Oh my goodness, right? Just starting with the tech stack. Right, everything from the apps we're using, from the CRMs to the project management software and everything else. It's a totally different world, and what you're able to accomplish by having these tools is incredible. And I wish I had tools like that when I was working in the nonprofit world. And I don't think that the organizations that I worked at are unique in that they were not harnessing the power of technology and what I was talking about before in terms of a growth mindset and really focused on goals and progress to goals and things like that. And so that's a tremendous difference between the two.
It's unfortunately a common mindset to either have a scarcity mindset or one where the nonprofit feels they cannot invest or spend much money to do what they need to do. They have to do a lot with just a very little. And when you mention tech stack and approaches, I mean, these are two different ways. I agree that are significant between the two types of organizations. What have you seen to be either helpful? Is it a matter of education? Is it a matter of changing that mindset and informing people who are working with nonprofits to say, look, you don't have to be so stingy. You are able to be, or scrupulous. You're able to take advantage of all these wonderful, powerful tools. Or is there some other play that you feel or some other work that's at play that's causing them to say, we have to be so careful with every single dollar. We have to be tracked. Like, is it a certain moral dilemma that they have, or perhaps some other influence that they have that limits their ability and desire to spend on X, stacks, and general approaches?
Yeah, there should be a rule that to sit on a nonprofit board, you need to take 15 minutes and watch Dan Pelota's famous TED Talk, right? The way we think about charity is dead wrong, and it eventually turned out they built it out into a movie, Uncharitable, that was released just a few months ago. But so much of it is the mindset. And I guess, Alex, you're pointing out that it's the good news is that it's a matter of influencing the decision makers within these organizations, whether that's the executive leadership or the board of directors, the lay leadership. And so that's our challenge. That's a challenge coming from a tech company that's working with nonprofits where we have free competitors, right? And there are organizations are welcome to go to GoFundMe and use GoFundMe, and it will be free, and they'll raise $1,000, or they can work with us and spend a few $1,000s and raise $100,000, right? Like, but that's the challenge, which is, if I sit on a nonprofit board and I give $10,000 a year to this organization, so often that donor or that philanthropist, that board member is saying, I'm giving $10,000 because I'm supporting this soup kitchen. I want the needy, within my community to have a warm meal every night, right? I'm not giving them $10,000 so they could spend it on a CRM, right? I'm not giving them $10,000 so they could have a staff retreat, right? Or hire a fundraising consultant to help them grow on strategy. No, I'm giving it to feed the homeless, right? That's why I'm giving my $10,000 a year. And so that's the challenge, which is changing that mindset and saying, well, the idea actually is, let's take your $10,000 and let's turn it into $100,000. That's a growth mindset. That's what we need to start changing from this, as you said, Alex, the scarcity mindset, which is so dominant in the nonprofit sector, and say it's not a matter of shrinking the pie in terms of investment and evil overhead, but it's a growth mindset. If you were to turn to any business executive and say to them, hey, I have a proposition for you, a business investment that has an excellent track record where you'll invest $10,000 and in 2 months, you'll make $100,000. There is no business executive, no investor who will turn that down, right? Especially if you have the data to show that it really works. But you go to a nonprofit donor, philanthropist, board member and say, will you invest $10,000 in this technology, in this fundraising strategy, in this consultant, right? Why would I do that? Again, I'm giving money to buy the food and to keep the food pantry, the soup kitchen open and running. So that's really that challenge is breaking out of that scarcity mindset into a growth mindset.
So I'm happy to announce that if and when I become a board member at some point, I will definitely donate to Technology Stack and Technology Stack only. I want them to have the most powerful CRM and the most powerful tech stack possible, because I know firsthand the power that it can bring, the return on the investment, the ability to keep doing what they're doing and automate. Who knows what's going to happen in the future with AI, but I am happy to do that because I know that they say that in the construction business, tools is 50%. Having the right tools is 50% of the job, right? Yes, you can get by with a handful of tools. You could build a house, but if you have the proper tools, your job just becomes so much easier. You can build higher quality stuff faster, cheaper, and so forth. So you have to make that initial investment in those tools to be able to produce those kinds of results. And that's how one way I would say, where I try to communicate the value of these kinds of tools, of which CRM and tech stacks are just tools.
100%. There are force multipliers, right? They empower the employees, the staff, the volunteers to do so much more. One of the things, again, I mentioned the famous TED Talk by Dan Pelota. If any of your listeners haven't seen it before, Alex, if it's okay for me to say, stop this podcast, take 15 minutes. Everything we know about charity is dead wrong. Just Google it, Dan Pelota. You gotta watch it. It's so good. It's so good. One of the things that he says is that, when you talk about marketing, in the for-profit world, the idea is you spend every dollar in marketing until it stops producing $1.01 more in revenue, right? Like you keep on pushing in marketing and advertising and PR and everything else until there's no longer a return, right? Whereas nonprofits are starved for the engine for that growth, right? Nonprofits should take out ads and should be spending money on marketing. No, absolutely not, right? Again, that's not why I'm giving my money to this organization. But a strategic philanthropist, and Alex, I bless you and me both that we should both become those philanthropists. Say, I want to take a business approach to my philanthropy, and I want to see a 10x return on investment. And that's the mindset that we really need to help engender throughout the sector.
Diving a bit deeper on that approach, the metrics, the tracking progress, the goal setting, because you mentioned in the example that you gave, here are your 12-month or your goals for the next 12 months. Good luck, as opposed to tracking it on a more frequent basis. I imagine there's more to it than just tracking it on a more frequent basis. What are some tools or some mechanisms that nonprofits can use that can allow them to establish guidelines or an ability to set up themselves to track themselves more? Like, is it just more checkpoints? Is it more aid to figure out how to get them from that stage to the next stage? Like, how do they improve their overall approach with metrics?
Yeah, really great question. Really great question. So a lot to say about this. The first is, just having metrics and just having clear, tangible goals is super valuable. What we say in the work that we do at CauseMatch, since we do peer-to-peer campaigns, and so in our campaigns, individuals who are within the community of the organization take on personal fundraising goals, right? And so you have the way we do our campaigns is, let's say you have 50 individuals, volunteers, donors, board members, et cetera, from the organization. Each person takes on a goal of raising $2,000. 50 people, $2,000 each person with their goal. You have a campaign to raise $100,000, and we do it in the context of a giving day. One of the things that we say, why that's so important, is that we don't want people just showing up and taking on, an ambassador page and sending it out to their friends and family. They need to have goals. The phrase that we use is goals create reality. Goals create reality. It's so true in life in general. When we set goals for ourselves, I'm a runner, right? I run basically twice a week. I do a 10K, twice a week. And I track my progress week to week, month to month, year to year, right? And when I started being much more intentional about what my goals were, what my running goals were, and oh wow, I'm 30 kilometers behind where I need to be if I want to reach my goal for this year, right? Or I'm fit. That drove me to do a third run for a week or two, right? In order to start catching up. So goals create reality. That's number one. Number two is, when I was, like I mentioned, the ED of a small nonprofit, it was an advocacy organization advocating on behalf of women who are victims of domestic abuse. And a large part of our work was changing hearts and minds, changing the definition or the way that people think about domestic abuse. And without getting into the weeds on that, how do you measure changing hearts and minds, right? Like, how do you measure, are we changing the attitude of our community around this issue, right? We don't have a implant in everyone's brain to get a sense of, are they more sympathetic to this issue now that we've done our work for the past however many years? But what you can do are set indicators. And in the for-profit world, we talk about leading indicators and lagging indicators. So it's not just about hard numbers of how many widgets you've sold or how much money you've made or money that you've raised, but what are the other indicators? A leading indicator is, how do we know that we're on track? What are the things that are leading towards where we want to go? And then lagging indicators, what's the impact, the effect of, now that we've accomplished what we're trying to accomplish, that we now see those ramifications. So we couldn't measure hearts and minds of whether or not we're changing people's attitudes towards the issue of domestic abuse. But there were other indicators that we could track. And now that I've been in the for-profit world and thinking about leading and lagging indicators, there are actually a lot more indicators that we could have been tracking that we weren't at the time because we just didn't have that mindset. So that's one thing that I would think about, just leading and lagging indicators. Then the next thing is in terms of, this kind of goes back to goals create reality, which is tracking your own progress. And again, let's talk about fundraising, because that's really my passion. That's what I've been doing for my whole career. When you think about fundraising, it's not just about the dollars that you've raised, but how many phone calls have you made to certain donors, to donors in general this week? How many emails have you sent out? How many personal handwritten cards did you write to donors, to board members, what have you? These are things that you can track. And once you start tracking them, then you can start seeing your progress and start seeing what are the leading indicators. How many phone calls and greetings and handwritten notes do I send to donors where it starts to have an impact on how much they're giving? So these are just kind of speaking in broad brushstrokes, but things that organizations can start thinking about in their work.
For measuring attitudes, the word that I hear often is proxies. I think that's the same kind of thing as leading indicators and lagging. You can't measure the thing itself, but you can measure a proxy that is kind of closely related to and is influenced by what you're actually trying to measure.
Yeah.
And then the second, the tracking progress, I mean, I want to add to that is it's basically a numbers game, right? The more phone calls you make, the more cards you write is a type of way of measuring an eventual outcome, because there's a typical sales path, right? You contact 1,000 people, 100 will reply, 1 will make a donation kind of thing. There's that factor of 10 or divided by 10, so that the more activities you're doing, the more likely you are to get that final donation and increase your fundraising.
Exactly right. And again, in the work that I do at CauseMatch, I have a dashboard within our CRM where, I mean, the number of metrics that we're keeping track of in seeing the progress of each and every person who's working. I work in partnerships specifically, but on the partnership side, which is our partners' sales channel, or in business development directly, more broadly speaking, which is direct sales, the number of metrics that we're tracking, it's tremendous. You actually see, you can predict from there. Even if it's we're now, started, the beginning of May when we're recording this. So we're the second month of Q2. I have a good sense of where I'm going to be in 2 months from now, based upon where my metrics are today. And that's because we're tracking these things.
I love the expression, what gets measured gets improved. And I think that applies to everything, including your running.
I love that.
I'm curious to know, because at a certain point, though, like there is obviously a point where you measure. I mean, is there a point where you measure too much, to the point where you're spending more time measuring things and gathering data to measure things as opposed to doing the actual work? Is there a trade-off there? Is there a balance there, or is it really as much as you can measure, go all in for that, because that will give you better outcomes?
Sure, I can imagine a situation where it's just too much. But I guess the question is, as long as it's meaningful, that it's actually driving your decision making, that's really what you want. If you're tracking, I don't know, like how long your emails are, right? I mean, I'm sure there certainly are best practices in writing emails, but if you're tracking, sentence length or something, it's like, okay, that's not going to be a meaningful metric to track. But I again, from my experience, and now that I've been working over the past 3 years at CauseMatch with hundreds of nonprofit organizations, I think where the vast majority of organizations are, we can err on the side of pushing too much on the metrics, because there's just not enough that's being done so far.
To give you a concrete example, I have one of my clients, a Salesforce customer, that tracks meetings with various people, and there's all kinds of parameters they can add to the meeting summary. How whether the meeting was in person or by phone, whether it was done on a particular day. And I asked them, yes, we can track it, but what are you going to do with that? Is there, if you're never going to build a report based on how many meetings you have versus how many phone calls you have, then there's no point tracking that number. Let's just remove it. Let's hide it. There's no reason to add to the complexity of the system. If you are going to use it, great, we'll add it. But if you're not, so the question I try to ask is exactly that. Is this too much data, or is this going to be usable data? And if so, show me how you're going to use it, and then we'll build it.
Right. And you know what? I think that's where a consultant, a real expert, can come in to help create the system for you and guide the organization in what are the things we should be measuring, what should we be tracking. As you're talking, Alex, I'm thinking about email marketing, right? There are best times to send emails, right? And certainly best practices around crafting emails and all of that. But that's not something that the organization necessarily needs to track on their own and see, okay, for the next 6 months, when we send emails on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Thursday, where do we get the best open rates? There are experts who know that already, right? Like, you don't need to do that work. There are experts who can guide you in it and already get you to the next level.
In terms of borrowing other mechanisms or methodologies from the for-profit world, as we were talking earlier, there were two of them that came to mind, and this is more for a typical sales team at a commercial company, and that is gamification and recognition. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, do those two have any place in the nonprofit world, or is that too competitive?
Oh man, gamification is how I spend so much of my time in the crowdfunding space, right? So we're crowdfunding for nonprofit organizations, and gamification is huge. It's huge. For some reason, the way that our brains are wired is that we like playing games and getting a little badge on an app because you used it a certain number of times. As an example, I do the New York Times Wordle every day, right? And I'm so mad at myself. Why? Because this past Sunday, I forgot to do the Wordle, and I had a 149-day streak. And I'm so mad that I'm now down to like my 4-day streak because I broke my silly 149-day Wordle streak. That's gamification. New York Times does that for Wordle, just so people like me, and this is how our brains are wired, are gonna make sure we do the Wordle every day because I want to keep up that streak. So it applies to Wordle. It applies to people's engagement with an organization. It applies to fundraising. So I think gamification is really valuable. What we do at CauseMatch, and I'm not here to talk so much about CauseMatch, but just to apply it as an example, is we're taking some of the best tools and practices of the e-commerce world and applying it to nonprofit fundraising. And gamification is certainly an aspect of that. So I'm a big fan of that. And what was the other one that you mentioned?
Recognition. So it's awarding people. So the gamification is like the pre, right? You're basically at leaderboards, for example, or like you said, different mechanisms. The recognition is more like you mentioned earlier, the badges or the employee of the month or the employee of, in this case, the fundraiser of the month. So the ability of just saying, we recognize you for all your hard work, and it also, which makes them feel good and also encourages others to want to pursue and try to get those kinds of awards and those kinds of titles as well.
Yeah, it works. It works. And it's not just a matter of it works. In the nonprofit world, when you have donors, when you have volunteers, whether they are board members or just someone who's showing up, again, going back to our soup kitchen example, and showing up every Wednesday night and volunteering at the soup kitchen, they're not doing it because they want to receive a plaque on the wall, right? Or something to put on their desk as recognition. but it goes so far, right? People so appreciate being recognized. They're doing it because they want to give back. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. They want to make a difference and have that sense of meaning and purpose, but recognize them for it, right? And it will go so far. And it's the right thing to do because people are giving of their time and their treasure in order to advance the work of your organization. So give a little back by recognizing them and thanking them. It's really about thanking them. I think that's fundamentally what recognition is about.
As we were talking, I was trying to research at the same time. There's a book that I read, and I didn't have enough time to research it as we're talking, and I'll try to find it afterward and put it into the show notes. But the book is about motivating people, how to motivate people, and moving away from the carrot and stick model, which is again external, and getting them to find and build their internal motivations to get that satisfaction, that happiness, that joy from just succeeding in a certain way that isn't dependent upon external factors. So it's kind of the counterpoint of the gamification and recognition side, but I think it's part of the same or the other side of that coin, in that there are ways to motivate people and fundraisers in this case, in our conversation, to be able to become better motivators, to be more inspired. That does not involve a punishment or a reward. It's more something that they can own and build inside them, and you can cultivate that. And I'll find the book and I'll definitely share it in the show notes because I think that the principle is phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure of the book, but I think that's a beautiful idea, and I would love to learn more about that. It's interesting because I was just meeting with a nonprofit fundraising consultant, and because that's what I do. Those are our partners, and I was speaking with them about the difference between the way that we do peer-to-peer campaigns and the way that they so often are run. So often a peer-to-peer campaign is a run, walk, or ride, right? Where an organization is organizing a 5K and they're going to have 1,000 runners on a Sunday morning and asking each of those runners to raise money for the organization. And so in that sense, what are people fundraising for? I'm fundraising because, you know what, I'm running for this cause. I'm really there because I like running 5Ks, or in my case, 10Ks. And so I'll send out a link to my family and friends and I'll raise a few $100s. But the focus is more about the race than it is about the cause. And that's not how we typically run peer-to-peer campaigns at CauseMatch. Our campaigns are about individual ambassadors taking on personal fundraising goals where there's no race, there's no 5K, right? It's just about these ambassadors coming together around the organization, driving the mission of the organization forward. Each one taking on a personal fundraising goal because they are so grateful to this cause. They want to give back to the cause. And you're talking about intrinsic motivation. That's what's motivating them, not because they're going to get rewarded or a thank you or a trophy, but they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves and give back and say thank you and be a part of the impact that this organization is having within the community. And it's so deep, it's so valuable, it's so much more successful from a fundraising perspective as well.
I was able to take a few more seconds and I found the book. It's called Drive by Daniel H. Pink. And it's the subtitle is The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. So I will put that book rather, in the show notes because it's phenomenal. I highly recommend it.
Beautiful.
This is one question I'm starting to ask more and more of my guests because it's an interesting one. Well, I find it's interesting. And that based on the conversation we've had so far, if you had a magic wand that could change one thing about the nonprofit space, what would it be?
Such a great question, right? If I could change one thing within the nonprofit space, you know what, we've been talking about it throughout this conversation, but it's really that scarcity mindset. Changing it to a growth mindset. It's fundamental. It's a fundamental change where an organization is not stuck with the resources that it has, trying to divide those resources into smaller and smaller parts, but rather saying, how do we take a $1 million organization and turn it into a $10 million organization where we're having not 10 times the impact, but because of economies of scale, 20 times the impact or 50 times the impact. That's a growth mindset where you're changing the world on a fundamentally greater level by investing in your growth. So if there's one thing I could change in the nonprofit space, that's really what it would be.
All right, Jeremy, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I was hoping, because I know this is just the beginning of a conversation, but if nonprofits or other organizations have questions that they can ask or they want to ask you, how can they? How can they get in touch with you?
I spend way too much time every day on LinkedIn, so you can find me any day on LinkedIn. Just search for me there, Jeremy Stern, and we'll connect that way.
Awesome, Jeremy. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure, Alex.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.